So I want to welcome everyone this morning to our Southeast Indiana District ANR webinar series. And we have several co-hosts for our program this morning. We have Jill Richards, who's the Ohio County Extension Educator. We also have Britt Copeland, who is the Jefferson County Extension Educator. They will be our speakers for this morning's effort on forage quality. We also have Tom Springston, who is an educator from Scott County, who will be kind of monitoring the chat box and answering any questions. So if you have a question during our program, you can put that in the chat box, or we'll have some time to unmute and ask questions at the end of the program. So Jill or Britt, I'm not sure who's going first, but I will turn it over to you guys.
Okay, thanks, Kyle. I'll start it out. My name's Britt Copeland. I'm from Jefferson County. So today we're talking forage quality. So we're going to go over some topics today that relate to how to sample your forage, how to read the results of a forage sample, how to apply that, doing a informal sensory analysis, and then finally, once you get all that information done, how do I go about actually improving my forage? I have a little picture of the Purdue Extension Forage Field Guide on here. I just wanted to draw attention to that. Purdue Extension has a lot of great resources on forages, and that's where we get a lot of the source material for our presentation today. So that Forage Field Guide, if you haven't checked that out, you can pick one up at your local extension office. It's really handy and has fits in your pocket and has a description of all the different forages and how they relate to soil types and what they're best used for. So it's a really good resource. And we'll have some of our resources linked in our PowerPoint slides. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please put them in the chat. We've got Tom monitoring the chat today, so he's ready and willing to answer any questions, and we can stop or go back however you guys need. So we're going to begin with a little bit of just forage sampling. So the pictures that I have on the screen are some of the most common types of forage testers. And a lot of these options are available for you to borrow in your extension office. When testing your forages, you want to make sure that you're getting a representative sample. And what we mean by a representative sample is something that's going to represent most of your field. So you'll want to take it all from one cutting, and you want to do several bales, collecting a little bit from each. So the first one that has a jar on it is a hand sampler. It's a little bit harder. You stab it right into the bale. And then the second one can actually be attached to a drill. Ooh, my little thing's in the way. So this is a video on how that sampling would work. When you're sampling a round bale or a square bale, you always want to come at it from the side. You want to get through several layers of that bale to make sure that, again, you're getting a representative sample and it's getting all of those different things. Here in just a second, we'll go over how to submit those samples. But when you're doing that, you'll want to make sure that you take several stabs and get the right amount of hay or forage or silage, whatever the lab requires. So you don't want to just take one stab, you want to take a couple from a couple different bales in your field. For example, if you have 10 acres of hay, you might want to take samples from 10 different bales to get that representative sample. So what are you looking for in a forage test? Really, that depends on whatever you're feeding. But the most important values that you're going to be looking at when you take a forage test are the energy values, the moisture, the dry matter, the crude protein, and a couple other values that Jill will dive into a little bit more in depth. We recommend a couple different labs. The one lab that we're going to be talking about today is SureTech Labs. They seem to do a pretty good job of making the results readable and easy to understand. There's several different packages. This is all the information that you get off of the Forage Basic package. If you've got a horse operation or a beef cow operation, you might want to consider doing a little bit more, a higher level package, just because equine, you're worried about sugars. And if you've got a cow-calf operation, you might be worried about other macronutrients like calcium and selenium, common things that cattle need and are often deficient in. So backing up to those mineral values, do you need to know all of those different acronyms? Well, yes and no. Knowing the mineral needs of your operation and the trace minerals in your soil is important. Most commonly here in Indiana, the deficient minerals that we deal with are sodium, calcium, phosphorus, magnesium, zinc, copper, and selenium. You can get around a lot of this by feeding a commercial salt mineral mix, but you also might want to consider consulting a nutritionist. So the different feedstuffs that you feed, whether that's silage, haylage, or just plain hay, have different levels of those minerals in them. This is an example of the submission form for SureTech Laboratories. You can submit several samples at one time. For example, if you have several cuttings of hay, you would want to do each cutting as a different sample, making sure that those are representative and that you base your information off of that cutting that you're most likely going to be feeding over winter. For most cases, the basic package is enough, but they're pretty good about asking a lot of relevant questions. So what the sample is, where did it come from, and what you're looking for. Again, make sure you're sending enough sample material when you submit this so that they have enough to test. And then making sure that you're doing this probably on a Monday, not on a Friday, so it doesn't sit in the mail and get kind of gross. So yeah. So moving on, we're going to talk a little bit more about once you actually get the report back. And I'm going to let Jill chime in here.
All right, thank you, Britt. Hopefully you've got your report back, your analysis back. And some of the things that you're going to really want to pay attention to is as fed or on a dry matter basis. So the dry matter basis, you want to look at that column, and that's just when all the water has been removed from your sample. As fed is with moisture in. So it's not that confusing. It's, that's something that hopefully is pretty self-explanatory. The sum of the moisture and the dry matter content in the feed on a percent of total will always equal 100. So you can't see this chart real well, but this just gives you an idea of what your report's going to look like. You'll have, if you can see up at the top, your name, the farm name, and it'll give you the sample ID. So it's really important. I know when Britt was telling you how to send in your sample, make sure the bag is labeled as well. So not only writing down the sample on the form, but also to make sure that it corresponds with the bag, because you may be sending in more than one sample. It's usually good if you have multiple hay fields or maybe separate cuttings throughout the year and you want to get multiple tests done. It's very likely to send in anywhere from 5 to 10 samples for your farm. So make sure that you identify each one of those separately, and then it's really a good idea not to just say sample 1, 2, 3, or 4, but also maybe give a location. If you don't have your bales labeled in the barn, write those down. There's been several times that I've helped clientele. We take a bunch of samples. I'm like, how are you going to remember this is sample A when you get it back? And so making sure that it's written down somewhere else. So we took sample A maybe from the back part of the barn, the left side of the barn. Maybe it's the first row, whatever. Have those marked somehow, some way that you know where that sample came from, because not everybody labels their hay as they do it. And just wanted to throw that out there. So that's one thing that's important when you're reading your samples, making sure that you're reading it from the right hay. So doesn't want me to advance. Somebody want to, there we go. Thank you for the help. So your nutrient values that you want to pay attention to, the TDN is really important. It's the total digestible nutrients. It's an estimate of the energy content for the feed and the roughage. So that energy is the value that you're really going to be paying attention to, because that's going to tell you what's in it, so you know what you're going to need to feed. Crude protein, that's probably another one of the most important things that you're going to look at, and that's just going to look at the total quantity of true protein in the plant tissue. So, you want protein that's going to be fairly high depending on what you're feeding. The higher the protein, the higher the digestible nutrients that you have, the less supplementing you're going to need to do. I know that has a big factor when you're figuring exactly what your hay is. The crude protein levels, that's going to be affected by the kind of hay that you have, the time in which you harvested it. Did it get wet? Did you keep it dry? Those kind of things. Did you maybe bale it when it was too wet? Those things are all going to be factors in the crude protein, and that's going to affect your hay. Your acid detergent fiber, which is your ADF, is the percentage of highly indigestible plant material. The higher that level, the levels are generally associated with a lower digestibility. And then your neutral detergent fiber, the percentage of cell walls or other plant material that's present. So the lower those levels generally is associated with a higher animal intake. So those are things that you want to make sure that the NDF is lower, and that way it'll give you higher intake. Relative feed value, it's the forage's expected intake by animals. Animals can only eat so much. They're going to eat as much as they possibly can, but they still might not be able to get enough nutrients that they need out of the hay. They can't eat, over their weight in hay. You think, well, they're getting all the hay that they want and they're still not gaining weight. It's probably a poor quality hay that they're eating. So you need to make sure that you're giving them the adequate nutrients that they need in their hay if you're not planning on supplementing. But if the hay is poor quality, then you're definitely going to have to supplement. Feeding low quality hay for a month can drop a cow, for instance, an entire body score. So you don't want that. That's losing about 100 pounds in a month if the forage quality is really low. So next slide. So here's just some requirements for TDN and crude protein requirements of cattle. So if you're got a growing beef steer, whether they're 450 pounds or 650 pounds, depending on what you're wanting your daily gain to be, these are the optimum levels that you want it to be at as far as your crude protein and your percent of TDN. Now, if you're just feeding cows and they're lactating, it's going to be higher, obviously, than if the cow was dry and just pregnant. You don't want to get it too high with crude protein when the cows are dry and pregnant, because that's going to feed the calf and make the calves bigger than maybe what the cows can handle during calving. So these are some requirements as you're looking at your forages where you actually need to be. Next. Okay, so here's some mixed hay results. I think there was another chart on here one time, maybe, I don't know. Mixed hay results. So here's just some a little bit closer for you to look at. So for your mixed hay, your crude protein, you're at a little over 12%, almost 13%. So if you think about, if you've got some calves or if you've got cows, that's probably a good number to be at. We're just going to keep talking about it. It's okay. So the table is not going to show, that's okay. So when you're applying your results to your herd, you've got some assumptions that you can make. And with those assumptions, whether you're feeding heifers or cows, where you need it to be and what the requirement is, it's okay. We'll just keep going. We can provide the PowerPoint later to the participants so they can see it. But with your assumptions that you're going to make, your mixed hay, and that the macro calories that are listed there with your mixed hay is 0.58. That's okay. You can leave it right there. So that's your figure that you're going to get with your crude protein. and find out exactly what the NEM, which is your net energy maintenance, which is a value that you'll figure on your analysis results. You're going to get those back, and you can go ahead and go to the next slide since that other chart's not on there. So if you have mixed hay and your macro calorie is 0.58 per pound, the cow needs 13.23 macrocalories a day. This is going to help you know how much hay she can eat. So she eats approximately 2% of her body weight. So you need to calculate how much is her body weight. So if it's at 1,200 pounds and at 2%, you're 23.5 pounds per day, which a cow can eat that much. And she's going to have requirements that you want it to be 13.6 macrocalories a day. Well, with your calculations, with that feed that the hay sample that you have, she's getting more than that. So she does not need any extra energy supplemented. She's getting what she needs from the hay that's there. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so other things that are going to be factors when you have your hay analyzed, and you're going to get those results back. There's things that you also need to think about: your temperature, your wind, the mud, and the height on your livestock. So the temperature, if it's really, really cold and windy, they're gonna want to eat more. If they're in a lot of mud and tracking through it, that's going to also be a factor on they're going to need more energy. They're going to need more to eat. When the weather gets really bad here in Indiana, you know, I think yesterday, we had it almost 70 degrees, and then this morning it wasn't even 40. So the weather, you never know exactly what you're going to get, but that is going to affect your livestock and the amount that they're going to need to eat. So as the colder temperatures come, their factors change, whether they're going to be having calves on them, they're going to be calving soon. Their need is going to increase. So what might work when they're dry and they're pregnant, as far as the 12% crude protein in there, you know, their intake, then they're going to need to increase that, and you're probably going to need to supplement. So when it gets really cold and they calve, they're going to need more supplementation of nutrients through grain or minerals or things like that, rather than just the hay. Go ahead and next slide. So we've talked about the paper analysis, and this next part is a sensory analysis where maybe you don't think that this is important, but if you, I've always used this example because this is one that was given to me when I was much younger, that, you know, you can have an analysis on paper that says your forage is great, and it looks great on paper. It's got all the nutrients that you need, but the cows won't eat it, or they're just turning away from it. Well, you need to also think about looking at it. You can evaluate with your eyes and identify what's in the hay. You're going to look at it, see, you know, whether it's got grasses or legumes, or maybe it's full of thistles, and that can actually throw off your analysis and think that you have a really good quality hay sample when they've actually just got a lot of thistles in there. That analysis is not going to tell you on paper that those are there. If you're trying to feed small ruminants or even cattle at best, if you're feeding those with a lot of thistles, it can cause a lot of sores, and where the cows are not going to want to eat that. So look at your hay. It might be really stemmy. Maybe it's got some thick stems in it from different weeds that maybe were in your field. Those are also going to be things that's going to factor that's not going to show up on your paper. So get a feel for your hay. Check to see if it can be eaten. You know, is it palatable? Is the hay soft? Is it stemmy? Are there thorns in it? Things like that. That's going to affect the quantity that the cattle or your sheep or goats are going to be able to eat. And then also take a chance and smell it. I know that sounds a little silly to pick up your hay and smell it, but if you've ever had anybody check out your hay, that's one of the first things they do, and they're going to check for either a musty smell or burnt smell, or even a vinegar or tobacco smell, which can be identifying factors where maybe it was baled too wet, so it's gotten moldy. There's some mildew and things growing in it. Maybe it's gotten too hot. If you just baled some hay, and I'm sure people have experienced this before, if you recently baled hay and maybe thought it was we got it in time. It was dry enough, but after a day or two, you can smell it where it's starting to heat. That can be a risk factor for fires if you store that inside and you pile those up, but also a factor for, you know, the hay getting moldy, and that can have bad effects on your livestock as well. They're not only not going to eat it, but if they do ingest some, you could have some issues with that as well. So just as important as the paper analysis that tells you what's in the hay, you need to take the time to actually look at it, feel it, and check it out. Make sure that if it's something that you don't think smells right, or there's something in it, your livestock probably aren't going to eat it as well as they should either. So next slide. And I think this is where I turn it back to Britt, and he's going to cover improving your forages.
Yes, it is. And I just want to apologize again for that PowerPoint mishap, but didn't even faze you. So what a hero. So now that we've got our forage results back, and maybe they didn't come in right where we needed them, and now we're thinking about improving our forages. So starting from ground zero and establishing a new pasture or hay ground, there's lots of different things to consider: the soil type, what kind of animals are grazing on it, the drainage, all of those different things. A really common question is, should I plant a pure stand of alfalfa, or should I do it with a mixed hay? So let's talk about it. What's the difference between what's the benefits of planting a pure stand versus a mixed stand? So when you're planting a pure stand of something like alfalfa, it eases the management associated with trying to keep up all the species. You can use a broader number of herbicides, insecticides, and weed control, whereas that would be more limited with a grass legume mixture. And it ultimately improves the forage quality. A pure legume stand is usually a higher forage than a pure grass stand or a grass legume mixture. When we're thinking about a mixed stand, there's also benefits to that. So when there's a mixed stand, it eliminates the need for a nitrogen fertilizer on pure grass stands, because the legume in the mixture will provide nitrogen for grass growth. It also lengthens the life of the pasture, because the grass will remain after the legume stand is reduced. Also, the legumes are more active in the midsummer, where cool season grasses are not. It also reduces the problems of legumes heaving, and heaving is where the soil cracks and the roots are exposed. The grasses hold the legume and plants in place better than a pure legume stand can hold itself. It also reduces the soil erosion on steep slopes. So grasses have a massive root structure system that are better for soil conservation purposes than maybe a pure legume stand. And sometimes it can improve the livestock performance, because there are more stuff in that stand. So what should we actually seed? So these are some seeding dates and seeding rates for some common legumes. When should you do this? If you're seeding something like alfalfa or clover or bird's foot trefoil, you can look at charts like these, which are available in the Forage Field Guide or on the Purdue Extension Forages page to find out. So a good seeding date for alfalfa in the spring is anywhere from March 1st to May 1st, or if you're doing a fall seeding, August to September. The seeding rate, which is in pounds per live seed per acre, is around 12 to 15. And you can look through this chart, or we can drop the chart in the chat after, where you can have some time to look over it. I'd really encourage you to, if you're going to establish a hayfield, you'll want to do a little bit more consideration than just looking at this chart. You'll want to probably do some soil testing and seeing what facilities you'll need to manage each of these legumes. The same thing goes for grasses. Something like Kentucky bluegrass is best seeded in the spring, February 1st through May 1st, or in the fall, August 1st through September 1st. And then you can see here the different seeding rates on there. Jill, do you have anything to add for these with these charts?
The only thing I might add is if you're planning on getting something established, it's a little easier, like you said, after a soil analysis is completed, but you could try to get that stand set prior to the fall coming in. So if you can do it in, like if you look at your orchard grass, it's probably better to sow that from August 1st to September 1st rather than waiting until the spring, just so you can have some growth and everything that you need to be able to probably harvest that better than you would if you waited till the spring. So planning ahead and getting that together, and if you want to mix it. So that'd be the only thing that I would add, Britt.
Okay, great. The third chart we have here is some suggested mixes. If you are considering the mixed stand route, this is a really good chart, and it's in the Forage Selection and Seeding Guide for Indiana. And if you'd like access to that resource, just let us know and we can drop the link in the chat. But it gives you an idea of what you should mix with what. So if you're establishing an alfalfa and a grass mixture, how much alfalfa should I seed with the orchard grass? And that's what this chart is describing here. So there's also the idea of improving your pastures by renovating them. So it's one of the best ways to improve forage yield and animal performance on maybe a low producing grass pasture, is to consider periodically renovating them. Renovating means renewing a pasture by introducing a desired forage species into a plant stand. It usually involves some type of disruption to the soil, liming, fertilizing according to a soil test, seeding a legume or a legume grass mixture, and controlling those weeds. Some of the benefits of doing that is eliminating the need for a nitrogen fertilizer because the nitrogen is being fixed through your legumes. It's a better seasonal distribution of the forage. You have an increased forage protein in your pasture. It's going to improve the digestibility and the palatability, and it's going to add higher mineral concentrations, which help prevent animal health problems, and it can improve the livestock performance in many different ways. So how you would actually go about doing that? First, you'll want to allow the livestock to overgraze the pasture in the fall so that tillage is more effective at tearing up that sod. And then you should test the soil, lime it, fertilize it according to those soil tests before the tillage. Then you'll want to find some way to disturb the sod. If you're worried about erosion, you can not overwork it. The sod can be disturbed 50 to 70%. If you're seeding some kind of clover, if you're seeding an alfalfa, you'll want to disturb it a little bit more than that, 80 to 90%. And it's probably not going to be necessary to reseed the grass, since those tillers in the grass are going to continue growing in the fall. Once you get that, you'll want to seed your legumes. You'll probably want to do that in the fall so that they have time to establish over the winter and so that you have better luck in the spring. You'll want to think about using a frost seeding inoculated legume in the late winter. And when you're selecting that, you'll want to think about using an improved legume variety. Once it's established in the spring, and the ground has dried out enough to support livestock, remember you don't want to compact your soil. You can graze that pasture until the animals start to defoliate the legume seedings, and then remove the livestock and let the pasture rest for about 8 to 10 weeks. After that, you'll want to top dress annually with something like phosphorus or potassium according to a soil test, and then continue re-renovating as the legumes are removed from the pasture. So our next topic is when should you cut your forage to make sure that you're getting the highest quality. So as forages do mature, they increase in fiber, and that makes them a little less digestible. And then the dry matter intake potential is also compromised with that higher fiber content. So if you've got something like a alfalfa pure stand, ideally you'll want to harvest those with about 4 to 5 cuttings once a month. Grass dominant hay is harvested every 40 to 50 days, allowing about 3 harvests. But when do you know how to start your first cutting? That's a different, where are we going? Nope, go back. Oops, let me, I have got a video from our forage specialist to talk about that. I'm just not doing good today, I'm sorry. So I will share my screen real quick and let, can you see, what are you seeing right now?
I see.
What, Jill? I didn't hear you.
I see Ron and Keith on the screen.
Oh, okay. So these are our beef campus specialists and our forage campus specialists, and they're going to talk a little bit on how to know when to cut your hay for the highest quality.
Science at Purdue University.
And I'm Dr. Keith Johnson. I am Purdue University's Forage Extension Specialist.
Keith, let's begin this discussion talking about when should we harvest a hay crop to both optimize quality and quantity in a beef cattle enterprise?
Well, as I see it, grasses like tall fescue, orchard grass, and timothy should be harvested for the first time shortly after the grasses begin to head and before pollen shed happens. Thereafter, grasses will be harvested on about a 6-week interval. Alfalfa, a common legume, should be cut when the flower buds are fully formed and beginning to bloom. Red clover, another common legume, should be harvested before 1/3 of the flower heads are in bloom. Flower formation in the spring at first harvest is not as good an indicator of when to harvest. Rather, we should be looking at the presence of crown buds as a better indicator. Grass legume mixtures should be complementary with one another. So we look at alfalfa and red clover really working well in a combination with later to mature orchard grass or a low endophyte or novel endophyte tall fescue. And harvest is dictated by the legume component of that mixture.
So, Keith, what's your recommendations for proper harvest moisture content of different types of hay packages?
Well, certainly bale density and the size of the bale dictates the right targeted safe moisture level to begin baling. Small square bales should be less than 20% moisture, big round bales less than 18%, and big squares should be in the neighborhood of 16 or 17% moisture. What happens with moisture above those levels is they promote microorganism growth that can result in excessive heating within the bale. And in storage, the internal bale temperature should be less than 125 degrees Fahrenheit. But higher temperatures should be carefully monitored because high internal bale temperature can bind some of the protein to fiber, making some of it undigestible, produce molds, which further reduces the quality of the hay, and then we can possibly look at fire being a real concern with excessive heat. If harvested too dry, so we get down to less than 15% moisture, we're going to find that we can have extreme leaf loss occur. And this is particularly an issue with legumes where the leaves are the highest quality portion of the plant.
Okay. And that was just a little snippet, because they sometimes say it better than I do, of when to harvest your hay. I'll get our PowerPoint back up. There we go. And share my screen again. Okay. So when you cut matters, obviously use those different tips and growth indicators on whichever forage you have to know when to cut. And then I'm sure that you're doing that with the weather so that you're not compacting your soil or getting a moisture content that's too high and is going to result in a fire risk. So Jill, I'll turn it back over to you. And I think that is all the slides that I have, unless I am missing any. Is that correct?
Yep, I think you are correct on that. Was our last slide. I'd like to open it up to questions at this time. Does anybody have any questions? I don't think I saw any pop up in the chat. One thing we might add is just how you store your hay. If you're able to store it inside in a barn, that's what might be best. If that's not an option, there are many different ways that you need to store it. If you can put it up on gravel, if it's round bales, put it up on gravel to help let the water drain. You want to face your bales north to south and line them up in a line nice and tight so the water can roll off. And the sun going from the east to west will help to get those dried off if they've got moisture on them. If you end up, because of space, having to stack them, you do need to cover them to help cut down on the loss that you'll have. Are there any questions? You guys can unmute and ask anything of us while we're on here.
I was just going to say, I know Joyce joined us here kind of late, but Jill did comment earlier, Joyce, that the PowerPoint slides would be sent out to everybody that was on the call for today. But if someone does have a question, you can unmute and ask that or put it there in the chat.
I'll add that most of our county extension offices do have forage probes in their offices. I know I have one here. It's usually rented out, it seems like about every week, or I do visit several farms around our county that like for me to come out and take samples. And then when those analyses come back, there are several of us that can review those with you if you have questions and get more in depth and do those. So if that's something that you're interested in, highly recommend that. You might be surprised and thinking that your hay is really good quality. And in fact, it's really not, and you're going to need to supplement over the winter.
Jill, kind of what's the turnaround time of those, getting those reports back? Usually
about a week. If you submit them on a Monday, you sometimes get them back as early as Friday or at least by the next Monday. Especially with an email. It does take a little bit longer if you don't have access to email, then they'll have to mail you results. But usually they always put my email if it's submitted for my county. Here in Ohio County, then they'll include my email in there, and then I can call and talk to the individuals and talk them through it and see where they are and what their goals are with the forage they're feeding.
Okay, and I'm assuming when you say sending several samples at once together, I mean, labeling them separately, but it's a separate test for each one of those?
Yes. So when you select multiple samples, they are labeled separately. They're on their own line on the sheet. There's like 6 or 8 spots on the sheet. I'm not sure without looking at one, but you submit those with your samples, and then it takes about the same amount of time, whether you submit 1 or you submit 10. You'll get your analysis report back pretty quickly.
All right,
Well, I'm sorry, I was just gonna say, is there an average cost for those samples, Jill, that you can kind of think of?
Each sample is $16. So whether you send in 1 or you send in 10, it's $16 a piece. So each sample is separate. But it's definitely well worth it to know exactly what you're feeding and kind of know the quality. So that way your livestock keep their optimum weight that you want them to keep.
There are higher test packages, but they only go up to $26, $27 if you want like a beef special or an equine special. But they are pretty affordable.
Yes. Yeah, the $16 is the basics that we went over today.
Okay, good. And similar to how Kyle or Brett, I'm sorry, was talking about soil samples, again, I would highly encourage folks to do that before you begin, like a, renovation or planting to begin with. And very similar to that, whether you're sending 1 or 2 or how many samples together, separate charge, usually a quick turnaround, but highly recommended to do that. It's a very minimal cost for thinking of the seed and the time and the effort and, machinery cost of doing either the initial planting or renovation.
Absolutely. You don't want to waste your money on buying fertilizer and things if you don't necessarily need it. So getting an accurate soil analysis back before you start the process is always a great idea. One thing that we didn't mention on ways to improve your pastures is frost seeding. And you can use your legumes. Generally, red clover is really good to use, and do a frost seeding, which is just a broadcast seeding that you can do generally in February. We always mark our calendar around Valentine's Day to do some frost seeding of our pastures. If there's a little snow or something, it helps to kind of track exactly where you are, but that's a good way to incorporate a legume in. And it works pretty well for our area to get that in and get it established. You want to make sure your cattle or your livestock are not on that field at the time that you're doing the frost seeding, and give it time to get established before you put them out there. But that's a good, quick, easy way to think about how to add it with without renovating the entire pasture, just getting that out there.
All right, well, any other final questions as we wrap it up this morning?
I'm just going to say you both did a great job and appreciate it.
Okay. So thank you to Jill. Thank you to Britt. Thank you for Tom for monitoring the chat box for us today. I do want to say this is a continuing series, and our next part of our series will be on December 2nd, where Richard Beckert will be talking about winter care of trees and shrubs. So we appreciate your attendance today. I'm going to stop the recording and